In 1997, the world was introduced to a uniquely different Final Fantasy game. Instead of battles looking like this, they took place on these isometric, diorama-like battlefields, where characters move like pieces on the chessboard. With a riveting story dealing with classism, morality, and political intrigue that's based on the same event that also inspired Game of Thrones. Not to mention, it has a devoted fan base that has continued to support and create content for the game 25 years later. Today, we'll dive into the making of this cult classic and see why many fans regard it as the best entry in the series. This is the story behind Final Fantasy Tactics. In the mid-1980s, the Japanese video game company Square was struggling to stay afloat financially. At the time, Square made primarily action games for PCs and the NES, and none were hugely successful. One of the early employees at Square, a 23-year-old Hironobu Sakaguchi, who was a longtime fan of role-playing games, pitched the idea for Square to make their first RPG. But his idea was shut down as the rest of the company felt RPGs traditionally had low sales. After seeing the success of Dragon Quest and The Legend of Zelda in 1986, Sakaguchi once again pitched the idea and was able to convince the founder of the company to allow production of his RPG under the condition that it was limited to a 5-person team. The game was meant to be a last hurrah for Sakaguchi and was aptly named Final Fantasy. Had the game failed commercially, he would have quit Square and gone back to school. During development, the resistance from the rest of the company motivated the team to work hard and long hours to finish the game. To everyone's surprise, Final Fantasy was an impressive commercial success, selling 400,000 copies in Japan, and kickstarted the Final Fantasy games as Square's leading series. Sakaguchi's vision and talent was finally recognized, and he went on to direct the next 4 Final Fantasy games, and was then promoted to Executive Vice President of Square in 1991. In his new role, Sakaguchi oversaw the development of a few franchises, including Chrono Trigger and Parasite Eve. Due to his involvement with numerous titles, Sakaguchi took a step back from the director's chair and invited others to take on the mantle. However, there is one idea he's been tinkering in his downtime. Sakaguchi was a fan of tactical RPGs like Fire Emblem and especially Tactics Ogre. He wanted to create a strategy RPG using the Final Fantasy world and setting, and came up with the name Final Fantasy Tactics. In his own words, "I'm the type of person who comes up with the name first, so nothing much else had been concretely set down." Despite that, Sakaguchi was serious about the concept. He trademarked the name in 1993 and created a brief design document for the game. But due to his heavy involvement with other projects, he was unable to realize it until almost 3 years later, when the director of Tactics Ogre himself joined Square. Yasumi Matsuno was a well-known game designer for his work in the tactical RPG genre. As a child, he grew up in a rural area where he felt his only entertainment were movies, TV, and books. His hobbies included making dioramas, and was particularly fond of World War II dioramas, which he used to make by researching at the local library. He would incorporate story elements into each of his creations. While waiting for the train one day, Matsuno stepped into an arcade and played games like Pac-Man. This was his first introduction to video games, and he was hooked. His fascination with the medium grew as he was captivated by The Legend of Zelda and Dragon Quest on the NES. So he dropped out of college and joined the video game company Quest in 1989. During his 6-year tenure, he directed the first 2 entries in the Tactics Ogre series and has cemented himself as an expert in the strategy RPG genre. Shortly after the completion of the second Tactics Ogre game, Matsuno left Quest to join Square. Matsuno had been a longtime fan of Hironobu Sakaguchi for creating the Final Fantasy series, and had always wanted to work on a Final Fantasy entry himself. Soon after joining Square, Matsuno heard about Sakaguchi's tactical RPG concept and immediately signed himself up for the project. In his own words, "When I came to Square and heard about this game, my immediate response was, please let me do it." In a sense, it was a perfect timing to make use of all of my previous experience, and a huge opportunity as well. And so began the development of Final Fantasy Tactics in late 1995, with Matsuno as the director and Sakaguchi as the producer. Matsuno and Sakaguchi wanted the game to be an approachable strategy RPG. Unlike Matsuno's previous works, they wanted the game to feel similar to other Final Fantasy entries, where players could clear battles with a small party of characters they had developed throughout the game. To bring this vision to life, the team made the conscious decision to keep battles small and limited the number of characters that can be brought into the battlefield, allowing players to focus on strategy and positioning rather than being overwhelmed by large armies. For the level design, Matsuno drew inspiration from his childhood love of dioramas, designing each level to be a miniature little world, from grasslands to towns and even underground dungeons. Early in development, Matsuno stressed the importance of keeping the game running at 60 frames per second, as he felt players have come to expect this level of smooth gameplay on his previous cartridge-based games, and moving to the CD-ROM should be no exception. However, due to the limited RAM on the PlayStation, each level was restricted to a max dimension of 16 by 16 grid, in order to keep the game running at a smooth 60 frames per second. The limitations sparked Matsuno to get creative and utilize the vertical space to add depth in the level design. As buildings or other structures could obscure the player's view, each stage could be rotated 360 degrees, allowing players to get a better view of the enemies. To help with the battle system, Matsuno enlisted the legendary battle designer Hiroyuki Ito, who was the father of the Final Fantasy ATB or Active Time Battle system. Ito also shared the goal of making a more accessible strategy RPG, as he's not a fan of the genre himself. In his words, "I actually have never liked strategy and simulation games. I find all the work you have to do with units, equipping them, switching weapons to be so tedious. My goal for Final Fantasy Tactics was to make a game that I wouldn't feel like walking away from, where the strategy would feel exciting and urgent." To achieve this, Ito incorporated his signature ATB system into the tactical gameplay, speeding up the pacing of the battles. Each unit has a charge time gauge, which fills up at a rate based on the character's speed stat. Once filled, the character gets a turn to act, allowing them to move and attack an enemy or use an item. The complexity of the battles is then magnified by an array of variables that affect the outcome of each attack. Everything from the elevation of the character compared to their target, to the compatibility of their respective zodiac signs is taken into account as the game calculates the success of each move. With all these factors at play, every battle in Final Fantasy Tactics feels intense and urgent. While Ito focused on the battle elements, Matsuno designed the character development system, which allows players to customize characters into various roles or jobs. He made extensive use of most of the original character jobs seen in earlier Final Fantasy games, including black mages, lancers, summoners, and thieves. In total, the game features 20 jobs accessible by the player, and is immensely satisfying to customize. During battles, characters earn job points, or JPs, for successful actions, which can be used to unlock new abilities. Even though there are about 400 job abilities, the team aimed to keep the gameplay balanced so that beginners wouldn't need to come close to mastering all the abilities to complete the game, while at the same time creating around 30% more content and abilities to appeal to completionists. Overall, the wide variety of jobs and abilities give players the opportunity to experiment and find the combination that works best for them. When it came to the music for this game, the initial plan was to go with an energetic and upbeat sound, in line with the main Final Fantasy series. However, Matsuno felt that this style wouldn't match the serious and realistic tone of the game, which explores complex human conflicts in a harsh world. To get the perfect soundtrack, Matsuno enlisted the help of two seasoned composers he had previously worked with on the Tactics Ogre series, the highly skilled Hitoshi Sakimoto and the creative Masaharu Iwata. You might think that having two composers would result in a cluttered soundtrack, but in this case, their styles blended seamlessly with creative themes and counter themes that complement each other beautifully. The music perfectly captures the mood and atmosphere of the game's various locations and scenarios. It ranges from dramatic and intense battle themes to more peaceful and contemplative tracks that reflect the game's story and character development. Altogether, the duo created 71 tracks that spans over 2.5 hours, with many fans hailing it as the best gaming soundtrack ever made. Final Fantasy Tactics features an engaging story that is complex and multifaceted, with a number of intertwined plot lines and well-developed characters set in a world that's rich in history and lore. The story is told from the perspective of the protagonist, Ramza, a highborn cadet who's caught in the middle of a military conflict known as the Lion War, where two opposing noble factions are vying for the throne of the kingdom. Along the way, he's joined by a diverse cast of characters, each with their own motivations and agenda. The story successfully tackles themes such as political intrigue, betrayal, religious dogma, and moral ambiguity. Many fans have likened it to Game of Thrones, as both stories were modeled after the War of the Roses, a period of English history in which dynastic houses of nobility upheaved the country into civil war. While crafting the story, Matsuno drew inspiration from his own experiences, infusing the tale with themes based on situations he had encountered during development. One recurring theme in the game is the class-based society of nobles and commoners, which was inspired by Matsuno's observations of the hierarchy at Square, where some senior designers were treated like royalty and held a great deal of social capital. In addition to the story, Matsuno created the world of Ivalice, a medieval fantasy setting that serves as the backdrop of the game's story. He took great care in crafting the details of Ivalice, creating a rich and fully realized world, complete with its own history, cultures, religion, and lore. He drew inspiration from European medieval history, myth, and folklore. In an interview with IGN in 2018, Matsuno described Ivalice as a canvas on which he and later others could create narratives. One such example will be Final Fantasy XII, which takes place in the world of Ivalice centuries before the events of Final Fantasy Tactics. In fact, 12 takes place during a prosperous period known as the Golden Age of Ivalice, where airships flood the sky. Contrasting that to Tactics, which takes place in the Dark Ages of Ivalice, where society has regressed to a medieval-like state. However, remnants of airships and ancient machines are referenced throughout the game. In the spirit of creating bonus content for completionists, the team added multiple optional characters and storylines, including Cloud from Final Fantasy VII, who can be recruited into the party and can even perform the same limit breaks seen in FF7. It just goes to show the level of detail Matsuno and team had put into crafting the world and story that makes it so captivating and memorable. After 2.5 years of development, Final Fantasy Tactics was released in mid-1997 and became an instant hit, selling 1 million copies in Japan alone and over 2.4 million copies worldwide. The game received critical acclaim upon its release. It was praised for its deep and engaging narrative, complex and strategic gameplay, and beautiful art direction. However, the game is not without its flaws, such as the bad English translation and brutal difficulty spikes, especially the battle with Bellius, which notoriously caused many players to restart the game from the beginning, as saving right before battle would not allow the player to change equipment or grind to level up. These issues were mostly addressed in the PSP remastered version of the game. Nonetheless, Final Fantasy Tactics was a commercial success, which led Matsuno and Sakaguchi initiating a sequel, which they unsurprisingly dubbed Final Fantasy Tactics 2. For the sequel, they decided to change the visual direction and adopt a 2D hexagonal system to avoid difficulties working in 3D, which was encountered in the first game. Jobs will still play a major role, but the sequel will have a stronger emphasis on confrontations between individual characters, in addition to larger conflicts. Unfortunately, the project was cancelled as Square did not agree with some of these changes. Also, Matsuno and Sakaguchi were both involved with other projects, such as Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy IX respectively, and just could not dedicate the time needed to make a successful sequel. Instead, 2 spin-offs were released years later for the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS. Even though both received favorable reviews, they lacked that polish of a AAA game and failed to capture the magic of the original. Although we have never received a true sequel to the game, it has not stopped fans from continuing to support and create content in ways Square Enix could have never imagined. For the past 25 years, dedicated and passionate fans have created fan content and continue to support the game today. One early example of fan work is the notorious FFT Battle Mechanics Guide. This comprehensive guide breaks down every aspect of the game's mechanics, from character stats and abilities to formulas for damage calculation and AI behavior. Many fans regard it as the holy bible of FFT, citing that you can basically create a clone of the game using this guide. Later, another group of fans known as FF Hacktics has made a name for themselves through their work on tools and mods for the game. They have spent countless hours understanding and documenting the game's code and data formats, creating a wealth of resources for other fans to create mods and custom content. An example of the impact of their work is FFT Battlegrounds. This is a popular betting game on Twitch where you can watch AI-controlled teams of characters fight against each other. The bets are based on fake money, which is good because let's face it, if they weren't, there's a non-zero chance that I might have done some real damage to my bank account by now. At the start, the AI generates 8 teams of 4 fighters each at random. Then the teams are seeded into a bracket to duke it out until only one is left standing, after which the entire thing starts all over again. The audience participation is what makes the stream so much fun to watch, as fans cheer on their team while their team fight for their digital lives in ways that they sometimes seem perfectly coordinated, and other times like hilarious train wrecks. One last piece of fan work to mention is the beautiful and intricate Unofficial FFT Board game. Created by 2 self-proclaimed psycho fans of the game, Bartek Kubica and Hubert Tielkowski, who worked countless hours over the course of 8 years through blood, sweat, and woodworking to create a physical board game based on the FFT series. Like the game, players take turns moving their characters and attack using their weapons and spells. The game is complete with a custom board, character sheets, dice roller, and even an app called Hero Card, which helps the player create characters and keep track of stats during the game. The game has been well received, and the 2 plan to continue refining and improving it. 25 years after its initial release, Final Fantasy Tactics remains a beloved classic among fans who continue to discover and enjoy the game, all thanks to its approachable yet complex gameplay, character customizability, intricate story and world building, and a fantastic soundtrack. Initially just a name, Final Fantasy Tactics has become one of the most beloved entries in the series. Fans can only hope that Square Enix will remake or create a true sequel to this timeless masterpiece.